Hello, Dr. Cohick. I'm so excited to have you on the A World of Difference podcast today. How are you doing today, Dr. Cohick?
Hi. Well, hi, Lori, and please call me Lynn. It feels a little too, I feel too important when you call me Dr. Cohick.
Oh,
That's,
you're very important.
but I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
Oh, it's an honor, truly an honor to have you here. I have been a fan for a while reading your work, and yeah, you just have so many incredible contributions to the New Testament study that many of us do as we prepare sermons, as we just are curious, as we learn. And I know that you've influenced many students in your time recently at Northern Seminary. And also, congratulations on your new role. You're moving to Texas.
I'm moving to Texas. I know for those people from Texas, they keep saying you're coming home. So yeah, I'm very excited to be moving to Houston Christian University, formerly Houston Baptist University. So some people might know it under that name, and will be focused primarily on their Doctorate of Ministry program. So really excited to join that new team. Of course, we'll miss all my friends and colleagues at Northern. So, there's a bit of bittersweetness with these things. But yeah, I'm very excited to move to Houston. I've been told, the summers are not great, but I just remind them that I've had to deal with Chicago winters. So
That's
it's
right.
sort of you pick your poison. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you moved to Chicago. Were you in Colorado before? Is that right?
Yeah, for a couple of years, I was at Denver Seminary, right there on kind of the Front Range, and very beautiful, and enjoyed my time there very much. But most of my professional career was at Wheaton College, which is
Okay.
also in the Chicago area. So, yeah, I've at Denver as well as in Chicago, and then I grew up in Pennsylvania. So I've not really lived south. I've
Hmm.
always had the possibility at least of snow at Christmas. And I think instead what I'll get are poinsettias that are actually planted in the ground instead of in containers for Christmas. I'm looking
Right.
forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll definitely be different down there. Texas is its own thing, but you'll have some good company down there with Dr. Beth Allison Barr and wonderful women that are also contributing to the conversation. So there's perks for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And my good friend, Dr. Sandra Glahn, who's at DTS, she and I and another colleague from Wheaton, George Kalansis, have started a project called the Visual. It's a visual museum. It's a museum that'll be online, free access, that shows photos of ancient artwork, for right now, just found in Italy, the frescoes, the mosaics, the catacomb art, sculptures, that represent what women were doing in the ancient church. And
Oh,
so exciting. Yeah.
that is
So
thrilling.
there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of fun things happening in the area of scholarship and scholarship with women. And as you mentioned, Dr. Barr, Dr. Glahn, they're all located there in Texas. It's going to be a powerhouse.
It is. I'm excited.
uh,
That is really great news. Yes. Oh my goodness. And there's so much scholarship that's come out in recent years about women in the early church. We just had Dr. Gupta on talking about his latest book, Tell Her Story. Such a a wonderful book. And I think in the world of women, so many women have been writing about these things for a while. But we always have new things to add to the conversation. And I've seen some documentaries. There's I'm trying to remember their names. There's some women in I think it's Edinburgh in Scotland that have done some research around women in the early church, and I've seen some of their documentary and going into these catacombs and seeing images that we hadn't known about before, and it gives this whole story, and it's so intriguing. There's a lot to discover right now.
there certainly is. And you bring in not just from the New Testament and authors that look at the early church, but you've got classicists that are writing on this. You've got art historians that are writing on this. So it's very interdisciplinary, which is exciting. And that, I think, again, increases our knowledge. And what we find is that women were very active in the formation of Christian theology, Christian worship and liturgy, just the whole enterprise of being Christian was not something that was just done by bishops and councils. Women had a tremendous role to play, and that's exciting. It's exciting to know the history, because I think if you know that, it helps you today kind of find your way a little bit easier. Yeah, it. I certainly was raised by parents who felt women can do whatever they want. Just go for it. I wasn't raised in a real conservative environment. And I'm grateful for that, because I don't think I carry some of the baggage that some of my colleagues and students do, where there just wasn't a vision of what women can contribute. But we
Mm.
find the historical record shows, yeah, women have been doing this since the time of Jesus, and certainly from the Old Testament perspective, lots of active Israelite women helping the people of God be faithful.
It's so true. I mean, I think so much of it is the lens. I hear your story quite often, women who are pastors, priests, scholars of New Testament and Old Testament, all of it, who have a story that they were raised in a tradition where they saw their person. They saw a woman who led and did all the things, and that there was no lid on how women could lead, and it was normal. And I think that's so much easier to go into a field like yours when you've had those experiences. But whether you have or you haven't, the opportunities are there. And I think the work that you're doing is so important, because I've had Southern Baptist men, friends, good friends, say things to me like, but 2,000 years of church history, women haven't really been pastors and leading, right? Um, and that's a big debate right now in the Southern Baptist Convention, right? We've had stories where Saddleback Church was recently kicked out because um, Rick Warren had ordained those three women before he left, and now Stacy Wood is one of the pastors. She used to be a friend of mine. And then at the same time, the conversation often doesn't focus on the very true reality that we have evidence. I mean, we have gravestones, for example, where you can find out this woman did this particular role in a church. Like, those things have always been there, but the curiosity hasn't been there. So, in your work, as you have discovered things, was there ever a moment that was maybe shocking or surprising when you found out something a woman did in church history? Or were you just always aware women did all the things?
No, no. I think I've been shocked. Yes, I've been shocked at finding things, um, and I think one of, perhaps broadly speaking, one of the most shocking is the recognition that um, we often read back into history our own presuppositions about what counts as leadership. And we so often today attach leadership with office titles.
Hmm.
And in the first century Jewish world from which Christianity emerged, um, the synagogue was quite I'm going to say egalitarian, and I don't mean that in the contemporary kind. I mean, it like they didn't have a hierarchy. Let me put it that way.
Hmm.
There really wasn't a strong hierarchy. And there was a strong emphasis on patronage. Now, patronage isn't all good. And maybe that would be a second surprise, I would say, is when I was writing my book on women in the world of the earliest Christians, and I was trying to wrestle with finding all this evidence of women doing all kinds of public events and having their word or their voice count in these community gatherings, or just they're out there, like there's statues of women everywhere in the marketplace and in the temples, and trying to match that with some of the language from the ancient philosophers and whatnot, that women are always to be at home and they're to be silent. And I couldn't put this together until I read more about the ancient practice of patronage. I mean, we also have patronage today, but in the ancient world, that patronage allowed for women to be like the mother of a city or the sponsor of a guild, like the clothes washing guild, or other guilds like that. We have a woman, Numakia, who created was very much involved in the fullers, which did a lot. They're like dry cleaners in the ancient world and clothes makers and that kind of thing. We still have her statue remains, and so I realized in certain contexts and with certain in certain parameters, women were very vocal and they were known as themselves, not simply as the wife of or mother of or daughter
Mm.
of, but in and of themselves. I would say another surprise, and it goes along with patronage, is that women often controlled their own wealth. So it's not like the Victorian period when a woman married and then all of her wealth was handed over to her husband. In the ancient world, when a woman married, most of the time she actually remained connected with her husband's with her birth family, with her father's family. She didn't join her husband's family, so to speak. So, although she brought a dowry, if they had any money, she brought a dowry, and her husband could use that dowry. If he divorced her or she separated from him, she was due back all the principal of that dowry.
Wow.
So if he, bet on the chariot races and won a lot, he could keep his winnings. But if he lost and then the marriage was ended, she was owed back all the principal, even if he had lost some of it to the ponies. So that meant that women had, they had, maybe leverage is too strong of a word, but they had some independence. Now, they couldn't execute documents on their own in court. They had to have a guardian that would sign for them. But we have court records that show it wasn't always their husband, often a family member, but not always, that signed for them. So, I mean, just finding these things, you think there was actually independent actions taken by certain women, especially women who had wealth, um, and that kind of that gave texture to the landscape in the ancient world. That women were doing a lot more. They were also still sexism, patriarchy,
Of course.
absolutely, but there was also initiative and agency, and that's exciting because then we can see women like Mary Magdalene who sponsored Jesus, and also, in a very different analogy, with Ananias and Sapphira. They
Hmm.
both planned to lie about how much money they were giving to the church, and they both paid the penalty for
Yeah.
it. And so when you start to investigate closely, wow, it's just an incredibly variegated landscape, which is fun.
It is fun. That is surprising about the dowry. I didn't know that. So that's a fun fact. Um, I think so much of it is the lens you've been given, and I'm sure this is something you think about and teach about. But um, I think Dr. Barr often gets the question like, "Why are you rewriting history and putting women in it?" She's like, "No, I'm not. They've always been there. We're just noticing them, and we're digging deeper into what all the nuances were surrounding them." You know, I mean, when I was in seminary, we learned exegesis, and if a passage is confusing, then you stay curious and you want to look at the whole of Scripture. But also, cultural exegesis is really important, and so understanding the nuances of culture and with the information we have now, sometimes you revisit things. Was as you were writing this second edition, along with many, I mean, Dr. McKnight and Dr. Gupta, Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, what are some sort of new insights that you started to include or brought into it? I know there's several new things, but what are some of the ones you wanted to highlight?
Right. Well, I think perspective made a big difference. So we wanted to talk about interpretation, like how did Augustine or Augustine, depending on how you uh, state it, how he interpreted Paul. This is very, very influential in the Western Church. What's the history of interpretation in the African American community and in the modern European community? In other words, it wasn't just perspective as though these minoritized voices are going to stay that way, but a recognition that everyone, including Reformation authors and uh, German authors of the 18th and 19th century, everybody comes from a perspective. There's no completely neutral reading, which then invites us to gather as a community and learn from each other, and that so I think the Dictionary of Paulinist Letters second edition pushes into that reality. One of the key goals that we had was that we would really open up the historical world of Paul. And because the historical world of Paul is very pluralistic. I mean, we think of, Jews and Gentiles as sort of binary opposites, but actually it's much more complex as you look into how people experienced paganism, and there's also a diversity within Judaism as well. And so trying to take that complexity and have that be recognized in the dictionary entries was a key value that we had.
I love that you brought that in. It's so important, and we can get so narrow sometimes in our Christianity. There's a vast ocean to swim in, is something I often say, and sometimes you're taught your little part of the ocean, and but it's so deep and wide and scary at times, and it can be a little dark without some sunshine if you get too deep, but it's vast. And the Orthodox Christianity throughout 2000 years has had so much nuance. And I think the more we lean into that, the better we understand. But it can be scary for some people. I love that you brought in more women and more people of color into this edition. How did that process go for you, and what were some of the insights you gained from it?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think from the very beginning, and I was looking back in preparation for our podcast, we met in September 2018. We started talking about when we were going to be meeting in June of 2018. And at that first meeting in September, it was 2 days. I remember we probably cut down a whole forest and Post-it notes. They were everywhere in our whiteboard, and just thinking always, always, as we looked at names we had, are we gathering up all of the names that we know of women and scholars in the majority world, scholars from underrepresented groups. I mean, and so that became that was always in the forefront. We were always asking ourselves that question. And what's so wonderful uh, to me now, and I've been in the academy just a couple of decades, but long enough to be excited about the fact that we could find top-notch scholars who are women, who are African American, who are like we're in your past living over in Singapore or in Latin America, or I mean, just around the globe. So I don't know if younger listeners today would experience this, but I know in the 80s when I was doing my classwork for my PhD, and even into the 90s, people would say, I'd love to have a woman contribute, but there just aren't any good experts around. Oh, that would
Mm.
be so infuriating to me. I think,
Yeah.
well, look harder,
Mhm.
or help them up so that they can get to that level, right?
Right.
Well, now here we are in 2023, and feel very fortunate. We were able to have a rich array of top-notch scholars who also represent the study of Christianity from around the globe, and men and women.
It's so wonderful to hear. And I mean, the sad reality is there are still some circles that would make that comment even in 2023, that there's no women to contribute, and it's mostly like because they're not listening, they're not looking. I mean, I did come from circles previously where white male theologians were all that are being read regularly in certain seminaries, regularly as men prepare for sermons in complementarian spaces, especially hyper complementarian spaces where women are not considered able to teach, which means write the books that they might read and all of it. So that does still exist in certain circles. How do you navigate through that type of thing? I know you've been in a largely egalitarian seminary with some nuance thrown in there, but how have you navigated those circles personally?
Right. Yeah. Well, so one advantage I have to thank my parents for not putting an E at the end of my name, Lynn. It is also how men spell Lynn. And so I have been confused from confused with being a male writer when people just look at the name. And I was doing years ago, I was part of a panel discussion at a conference, and the person who was convening it was organizing the various participants, and we got everything organized of who was going to do what, present on this or that. When we got to the conference and I introduced myself, that the convener kind of did he made some, uh, he jolted a little bit. And then that was it, right? So after the panel discussion, he said to me, I didn't realize that you were female. As we were discussing amongst ourselves for several months before the conference, who's going to do what. I never knew that you were a woman. And, I'm grateful that when he actually met me, he thought, oh, that's a woman. So, that part was nice. But he then went on to say, did I say anything wrong? Like, did I offend you at all? And I thought, no, not at all. I mean, it never occurred to me that he didn't know I was female. We were 5 or 6 New Testament scholars talking about New Testament questions, getting ready to do a discussion about a New Testament topic. So
Right.
you didn't need to think of me primarily as male or female. I was your colleague.
Right.
Um, and in this case, this person just had never worked with female colleagues. Um, so that's kind of a funny story that I like to share because it no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
But that there are others that of course, don't end quite as well with that. Yeah. So I think one of the ways that I've always been interested in women in the church. I've also, from the time of my graduate work, been interested in Jews and Christians in the early church, the first century and early church. And I wrote on that area. I was advised not to write on women in the church until after I had tenure because it was too niche of a project focus. It would put me in kind of a career cul-de-sac of being just an expert on women, as though that was a secondary or boutique kind of interest. I love writing on the New Testament, so it wasn't a problem for me to do that necessarily. What I think is that now in scholarship, there's a recognition that, in fact, studying particular questions around how women engaged the gospel is not actually a unique or uh, idiosyncratic interest, but can actually use the latest methodology and show the best scholarship possible, even with the subject being women. So I'm encouraged by that change in the broader scholarship. But to your point earlier, Lori, there are still areas where, depending on where a woman would want to work, I might caution to stick with the biblical text or something of more broad interest for your first book, and then go into women if you want, but establish yourself first, so that you're not, put in a career cul-de-sac.
Yeah. I mean, it's It's just the reality that we still swim in patriarchy, don't we? Just like
Yeah.
people in the scriptures we're reading about did. And so, when it's the air we all breathe, it's not fair, but it's how it is. And we have to give each other that kind of advice. And I would say both in my when I was in full-time paid ministry and now working in business, women talking to each other and giving each other advice has been really helpful for me. I try to be the kind of woman who mentors the younger ones too in these ways. We don't want to have to do that forever. We would love to get to a point where our daughters and our granddaughters are not having to have these women talking conversations where it's equitable for all. But until we get there, um, the choices we make, we're perceived differently. There's this narrative women have to work twice as hard as a man to just be at the same level. And whether it's business or working in the church or in academia, sometimes that's hard but true, which is
Well,
sad because sometimes women burn out in these executive level or high level positions. And it's sort of, it's a bit of a catch 22, right? So, how have you navigated sort of that type of thing?
yeah. Well, I think information is really helpful. Another area where we see this a lot is with student evaluations. In studies where students take an online class and they never meet the professor to know, they never meet them face to face to know whether they're a man or a woman. If the students think they have a man professor, they will rate the teaching, the grading, all of it as a better experience than if it's a woman. And it could be a man that is teaching, but if they think it's a woman doing it, they will also grade the man's class as less. So they did some studies where you had a man and a woman teaching 4 classes total. A man taught 2 classes, one as himself, a man, but the second one he also taught as himself, but the students thought he was a woman. And the same thing happened with the woman. And you could just see if the students thought they were hearing from a woman, they didn't like it as well.
Hmm.
And our culture in general gives less authority to a woman's voice,
Hmm.
whether she's an airline pilot or a CFO or CEO or a preacher or a teacher, especially a
Hmm.
teacher in areas that are predominantly understood to be male,
Yeah.
having that male authority, which would be biblical studies for sure and theology. So I think, first of all, kind of recognizing that is important so you don't blame yourself for things that's not your fault.
Hmm.
Secondly, educating the people around you. So I've done that quite a bit in my role as administrator, to let others know, both other faculty members, to even highlight it with students, to say, by the way, this is you're going to assume I will grade you more easily. You're expecting that. You'll come to me first and say, can I have an extension on an assignment before you go to a male professor? Just all of these things, just knowing them, shining the light on them, I
Yeah.
think helps, because then students don't want to be like that, right? They do want to um, have an openness to whoever is teaching them. So that's
Hmm.
that's one thing that I like to do. I think then also in terms of with women, trying to release us, and including myself, from this idea of being perfect, and which I think goes along with the imposter syndrome, where if we're not perfect, then we really shouldn't be here. And giving ourselves, being willing to take risks, even if we know that at times, sometimes these risks won't work out and will quote unquote fail.
Mm.
That, those sorts of things I feel are very much a part of men's lives, but are not as much a part of how women are talking about their experience as they grow into adulthood, and then into their careers or their volunteer careers, whatever they plan to do in the church, and as they impact their own communities. um, I I would love to see more of risk taking, if you will, because I see that as very much a part of the experiences of women in the biblical text that God encourages, right? That God affirms, that we can step out. We have Peter stepping out of the boat onto the waves, as Jesus calls him. But there are women who also metaphorically step out on waves.
Mm.
A Deborah in
Mhm.
the Old Testament, or in Esther,
Mhm.
and that we can do that now, right? So I would love to have churches focus on the possibility of women, and maybe risk taking is not the best word, but you kind of get what I'm
Yeah.
driving at, I think.
No, absolutely. Risk taking is huge. I saw some research recently in the business world around some of the women at executive level leaderships that they researched compared to men. The stereotypes we have are that men are the more risk taking, but when it came to executive levels in business, women were taking more risks. And I think that's why they were getting there. And it is maybe that aspect of working twice as hard, they're risking twice as much too. And when it pans out, because we have all this information too about when a woman applies for a job, men are considered for their potential automatically, and women have to prove themselves and be super overqualified. We still have never had a woman president. Like, there's a lot of issues in our culture around our stereotypes and our unconscious bias, right, around men and women, and listening to men's voices versus women's voice, even in podcasting in the United States. 85% of podcast hosts are male and only 15% female. And
I
that's,
had no idea about that.
isn't that
Wow.
fascinating? I
Wow.
know. I'm always
Yeah.
like, wait, they always say one thing we can do is talk. Why can't we? You know what I mean? But actually,
Yeah.
even that research turns out to not be true. When they research how often men and women talk in mixed spaces, it's equal. The one area where if you have a predominantly male group in whether it's a church staff meeting or business, if there's only I think less than 30% women or something like that, women talk less, but not more. And the stereotype is just absolutely incorrect. And they can trace it back to where it sort of came from, which I won't mention here because we won't throw that person under the bus. Um, but yeah, definitely there's a lot to think through. And I think, as you said, just mentioning that, raising awareness about it helps us I have those stereotypes too. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I've not had those same thoughts, right? So it helps all of us to get better. And it is inspiring as we read about women in the scriptures. That can be inspiring. Paul gets a bad reputation in some circles, until I read Cynthia Long Westfall's book, Paul and Gender. I think it's trying to, switch things for a lot of us. But yeah. And so, as you have written about Paul in light of women and different things, how do you explain when people ask you, how would you describe Paul's view of women?
Yeah. I'll tell you a fun story here. I'll often get asked, what do you think of First Timothy 2?
Yes.
Like right out of the gate, right? So
Hmm.
I was being interviewed for a job. Actually, it was at Wheaton College. I'll just say it, 1999. And I was interviewed by all men because there were just only men in the department at that time. And one of the men, we were going along, the conversation was, you know, going along as you'd imagine in an interview. And then one of them said, so what do you think of First Timothy 2, that women should be silent? And I didn't say anything. And I know, I just, was, hit a home run or go home was kind of what I was perhaps thinking at the time. Finally, another guy started chuckling around the table, and they realized, yeah, well, you just told me I shouldn't talk. Anyway, then I proceeded to give my analysis. But I thought, it's just sort of, even a couple of, in the last 2 years or so, a man has also, said, so I'm sure you have to wrestle with 1 Tim 2. And I thought, where I start, I actually don't start there. I start with Phoebe and Junia and Yodia and Syntyche and Nympha and Priscilla. That's where I start. And I assume that Paul is a consistent man, that he doesn't say one thing and do another. And so if he is working closely with these women as his co-workers, if he praises Junia as an apostle, as someone who he admires, who is in the Lord, uh, and is currently in prison, which was a horrific experience for men, and then was way worse for women given their vulnerability.
Mm.
Uh, and he praises her testimony, her actions. I think then he can't possibly assume that she just did everything by sign language, that she
Right.
didn't speak, right? Or that Priscilla didn't actually teach Apollos. I mean, Luke tells us that she did. She did so with her husband, but there's no sense in the text that she just stood by, as to look up stuff for her husband as he was uh, teaching Apollos. She was right there.
Mm.
Um, with Phoebe, most scholars believe she took the letter of Romans to the Romans. And if she acted as though most letter carriers did, as those who were responsible to read the letter and answer questions, then Phoebe's the first exegete of Romans.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just remarkable. So if Paul is doing all that, then it's incumbent upon me to look at a passage like 1 Tim 2 and say, what is going on here? We know that Paul writes letters to address specific circumstances, and often those circumstances are perennial problems, like in Ephesus with Timothy. There were heretical teachers and also teachings floating around, and Paul, from right out of the gate in the first opening verses, is cautioning Timothy against this kind of bad teaching, not just by women, but by men and women all the way through. Well, that means, we can take Paul's teaching even today and be on the lookout for problematic teachings in our church, teachings that come from a man's mouth and come from a woman's mouth. But in the ancient world, there were different ways that education was done. And that's true in your living around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone does the American experience of kids from up till 18 years old being in the same, men and women being in the same classroom. Education of women is a very problematic idea in a number of cultures, even today
Yeah.
around the world. When we lived in Kenya, that was certainly true. Certain tribes were more reluctant to have women in their 14, 15, 16 in school because of concerns of morality,
Mm-hmm.
sexual morality for the young girls. So I think Paul's 1 Tim 2 passage, where Paul insists that women must learn, is inviting Timothy to be creative about how he's going to teach women, because it's not going to be as easy as him just showing up at a house with a couple of guys and reviewing scripture with them, right? He's going to have to
Mm-hmm.
really think hard about how he's going to manage that. And certainly in Ephesus, where they look out onto one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, and how important Artemis and her teachings, or the beliefs about Artemis, I should say, were in that world. So, we that I come to 1 Tim 2 from an historical standpoint, from a standpoint that looks at all the other engagement Paul has with women in leadership and teaching roles, and I say, okay, now how do I make sense of this passage? And I think it can make sense. I think it is an important um, caution that the church not allow either men or women to teach falsehoods. But that's what I think is going on there.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many ways to interpret that passage, and certainly cherry picking it out of the context of the scripture has not been a helpful one, not one we would advise. Um, a little bit tongue in cheek sometimes when people ask me that. I just say, well, at what age does a woman have to be silent? And what does silent mean? Can she not sing? Are we not allowed to sing hymns? And like, is a baby girl allowed to cry in the nursery? I mean, are we allowed to shush our children in the row? Like, when you just stay really curious about all the parts, sometimes it just sort of blows the whole thing into like, oh, let's really be curious about all of it, right? What do these words actually mean? Digging into the word itself, what was going on? Was it one woman? Was it a particular
Yeah,
woman?
yeah.
Was she over what kind of like, authentain is this word that's not really well understood. Like so much of it, like once you start digging, you realize people say scripture is clear around this verse, and yet less is clear the more you dig, and that's not bad. It just that curiosity shows us the beauty of the layers of scripture that can keep us learning and growing and trying to understand what this ancient text has for us today. And I appreciate that you've done this work for so long. It's great work. We've learned so much from you, and this I have the
Can
book here
can
on
I
my shelf.
just can I just joke with you? Also, I will say in 1 Tim 2:15, she will be saved through childbearing.
Oh, yeah.
I say which, and it's the verb that we usually translate in the context. It has a semantic range for Paul, usually of salvation, like what we think of salvation. So I
Yeah.
just tell my students, that's why I had 2 kids. Now I'm saved, like I'm double saved. And of course they laugh and roll their eyes, and they know that that's not what Paul means. But in a way, I mean, Artemis was the god, the a midwife
Yep.
God. And so maybe Paul is saying, look, trust Jesus, even in
Right.
this most scary time, because lots and lots of women died in childbirth and
Yeah.
complications after childbirth. But anyway, I just say, yeah, to your point, it's like, oh, good. I have 2 kids. I'm saved. Like
You're good.
I'm good. I'm walking straight into those pearly gates. Yeah.
It's so funny. Yeah, I mean, the more I started to understand Artemis of the Ephesians and the way women were trusting her in childbirth, that verse began to make complete sense all of a sudden. It was always kind of this weird, I don't know what's going on there, but I wasn't hearing altar calls like, do you want to get saved by childbearing? Nobody does that, right? So it had to have meant something else, but it really, until I understood people were looking to her to be saved as they were bearing children. Of course, God's the one that has the power to, like it all made more sense. But I do just want to say, everyone get this book. Obviously, I've not read it cover to cover because it's a dictionary, but I'm so glad to have it as a resource. And I hope that people will pick it up and use it for whether you're a person who prepares sermons or writes or just is curious to know more. This is a great resource that you've provided for us. I know there's a lot of probably Northern Seminary students that are going to end up listening to this, and there's just a lot been swirling around the campus with students and the board and people leaving, you leaving. There's just a lot of feelings going on, and I know that you really love that place. So, yeah, as you finish out, is there anything you would like to say to the students or the faculty at Northern about your time there?
Well, it is a gift. They've given me a gift of incredible camaraderie, um, joy, uh, and intellectual stimulation that I will greatly miss, but also greatly treasure.
Aw, that's very special. They were so blessed to have you. I remember when I saw that you were going to be going there, and I just thought, wow, what a win for Northern. You're just you're an asset wherever you go. So thanks for being on the show today. We're going to have you stick around and talk to our Patreon supporters. Just with one little extra question here, but how can people find you and your writing as you go forward?
Yeah. Well, I do have a web page. I think it's Lynn H. Cohick.
Okay.
I mean, my husband does that. You are realizing right now that I am a total Luddite. I'm not on Twitter. I don't really do Facebook at all. Yeah, I'm just really bad on that. But people can email me at lynn.cohick@gmail. So that's an
Got it.
easy way to
Oh,
get a hold of me. And yeah, I'd love to
great.
hear from anybody. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. We'll link your website in the show notes so people can follow your writing there. Well, thanks so much for being on the show today. And best of everything as you move to Texas and spread some more joy down there. Maybe you'll enjoy that weather, and maybe you'll still get up to the north to get a snow for Christmas at some point. Hopefully, you don't have to give that up completely.
Thank you so much, Lori. I loved our conversation.
Me too.